G'day and welcome to another episode of Built by Dan. In today's episode, I'm going to be installing the steering rack and steering column, and to do so I will have to look at installing some of the suspension brackets as well. I'll explain why as we work through this episode. So, before we get stuck into today's episode, I just thought I'd cover off on a few more details from my previous episode where I installed the pedal assembly and remote fluid reservoirs. So, the install that I did for that episode was just a test fit to make sure that everything would go together as it should. It's drilling the necessary holes, tapping the necessary threads. When I go to install that for its final install, once I know that everything else that integrates around those parts has been installed and is in the right place and it all works as it should, I will be looking to either Loctite or anti-seize the necessary threads depending on what the desired outcome is. The other thing that I know I haven't touched on, and I apologise for that, is the frequency of my episodes. So this is not a full-time job for me. I do have a full-time job that I work Monday to Friday, and it is quite demanding, generally requiring additional hours, most afternoons, evenings. So this build is a weekend hobby for me. So I'm aiming to release a new episode every 2 to 3 weeks. I'm aiming for 2 weeks, it might be 3 weeks depending on what the step is that I'm trying to undertake and how long that's going to take me to complete that install and create enough footage to be able to develop a new episode. So apologies for those that were really interested or really keen to see a weekly installment, but it's just not really practical for me at the moment. Look, the channel's doing great, appreciate all the support, but it's just not at that level where I can be full-time on YouTube. Now let's get stuck into the steering rack and steering column assembly. Okay, so you might be wondering what I've just been working on there. Basically, this is the bracket that mounts to the wall of the chassis to hold the steering rack in place. It has a number of bolt fixings, but it then has another fixing in the other direction that holds the actual steering rack on. And unfortunately, by the time you put this bolt through and you then try and pass one of the other bolts through that has a mounting boss on it, it actually won't pass that bolt head. So I've had to shave down those mounting bosses slightly until I could get them clear of the bolt head. So that's just a test fit, but that basically just shows there that I can now, having shaved back the boss, clear the bolt head, and I'll now be able to mount my steering rack. What I'm going to try and do now is mount the steering rack bracket onto the wall, front wall of the chassis there. So this is just in front of the footwell. Just going to try and feed the bracket down in here, get one bolt in to start with, and then I'll look to fix off the other bolts across the top and then across the bottom. I'm just doing the bolts up finger tight for now, and then I'll go through and tighten them later. The large majority of the bolts on this build use nylock nuts. So that's just the one center top nut tightened off. I'll try and get these bottom ones in and make sure it's all aligned before I tighten them all off fully. And that's why I didn't want to tighten them all off. Slightly off, and it doesn't want to slide in. Back that off slightly to give a little bit of play. It's not like any of those lower ones want to go in nicely, so back that bolt off further and get them all in before I tighten any of them. All right, that's all the bolts sitting in nicely now. I'll go tighten them up from the other side. These bolts will all get torqued to the correct settings. It's part of final assembly. So given some of the issues I had in terms of fitment of the steering rack, obviously I got the bracket installed. I tried to do a test fit of the steering rack itself because it seemed like it wasn't quite going to fit right. Truth be told, it didn't fit right. So I've contacted the manufacturer and they've said that they will look into it and get back to me on Monday morning. So in the meantime, I'm going to move on to the steering rack itself. So here I have the steering rack. We've obviously got the bracket, and then I've just bolted on these couple of bearings that support the steering shaft. Fairly straightforward bolting them on. I suppose the bit that wasn't so straightforward was test fitting everything onto the steering shaft itself. So at the top end where it connects to the steering wheel, I had to pull out the steering wheel boss and make sure that it would slide on far enough so that when I put the nut on that there'd be enough thread there. As it was, there wasn't enough thread, so I've just had to grind down the end a little bit just to give it a bit more of a chamfer so that it slides further into the steering boss and I can get enough thread bite through the nut that goes on there. Moving along, we obviously got the two bearings. This bearing was fine, fit quite nicely. The rear bearing didn't do so well. So I have, as you can see, had to shave down just the one side of the shaft there, just enough for it to slide in. It's still a tight fit, but it at least allows it to pass through. It needed about 1 millimeter taken off it. And then we get down to the other end where the steering shaft connects to the steering rack input shaft. There's obviously a union joint that will connect between them. They do head off on a slightly different angle, but it was far too big, so it needed a little bit shaved off there as well. So now that I've done all that, it'll make it a lot easier when we go to do the final install. There's nothing worse than putting everything together and then you move on to the next piece and find out that they don't quite fit. So I might just move the camera around so you've got a better angle, and we'll have a go at installing this. There are a couple of bolt holes. So at one end, the bolt holes and the bolts are supplied. The other end, the bracket has been drilled out with an elongated hole, but the front of the, I suppose the dash panel in the chassis has not been drilled out. So what I want to do is bolt in the rear, see where that aligns the front, mark out that elongated hole, and then decide or shift it all the way to one side of the elongated holes, and then use that to drill the holes into the dash panel in the chassis, just so that they're all aligned to the front and rear. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just put a piece of masking tape. I found it's obviously a lot easier to mark the masking tape where the holes align rather than trying to mark the aluminium itself. So I'm going to have a go at bolting up this steering column bracket and see how it all aligns. I might actually then grab the dash as well just to make sure that it aligns with the cutout in the dash once the dash is sat on top. So you can see as we've tightened that, it's lifted it up to where it just wants to sit naturally based on the alignment of the holes at the rear or the front of the car. So I'm just going to double check that that is actually to one side of those elongated holes. It looks like it is, but I might just back them off slightly. Okay, so that should be our alignment. What I'm going to do is just go and grab the dash panel off the pallet and sit that on top just to see if the steering shaft actually aligns with the cutout in the dash. So that's about the best I'm going to be able to get the dash to sit for now. There are a few cutouts that I need to make in the uprights on the side to accommodate the top plate of that dash panel for the chassis. But for the purpose of what I'm trying to achieve here, I essentially just want to be able to see that the steering column is aligned with the center of the cutout here for the steering wheel. And that is pretty much perfect. I'm really happy with that. So I can remove that dash panel now, knowing that the steering wheel will align with the existing cutout. And I can keep going, marking out and drilling those holes so that they can be mounted in its final position. So I just thought I'd take you and show you exactly what I was looking for. So as I pan down here, although the dash isn't sitting where it needs to, you can see the alignment there between the steering column and the cutout in the dash for the steering column, and the steering boss obviously sits in front of that. So that's what I was looking for, just to make sure that the alignment was correct before I started drilling those holes. So I've put the dash back away. Now, with this sitting in its position, I'm just going to mark those elongated holes with the marker. And I think I'll basically be aiming just to get a bolt through the center of each of those elongated holes. That'll still give me a little bit of movement in either direction if I need to adjust it a little bit later on. So there's our marks that we made. I'll go get the drill and we'll drill those holes now. Once again, I'm just going to start with a pilot hole. Swap that drill bit out for the larger one. There we go. We can test fit those bolts now, and hopefully that will be our steering rack, or sorry, steering column mounted. And now we'll look at installing this. I'll start with those back bolts again, similar to last time. Okay, success. The holes line up to where we previously marked them and set it all out. Now to bolt these on, there's actually another plate that needs to be installed. Looks like that'll have to be raised right up to clear the steering column. So the last thing I'm going to do to finish off the steering column for now is to fit the electronic steering lock to that bracket. So I've got the electronic steering lock there. I've shaved off a couple of tabs that were unnecessary. It is out of another car. I'm not sure what it comes out of, possibly a Mazda. So some of the tabs that are used to mount that in the Mazda are obviously not required for this vehicle. So that's it, that's the steering lock fitted. So again, just to give you a closer look, excuse me while I climb in. There it is, all fitted off. You can see the hole in the footwell wall there where the main shaft will come out of the steering rack and into the cabin and connect to the steering column. Okay, so now that that bracket is installed, there's a couple of things we need to do before we can fit off the actual steering rack to the bracket. I'll show you what they are. Firstly, we have these holes for the steering arms on the side of the chassis, but they're not quite right for the rack that's been provided. I have been speaking to the manufacturer and they've been giving me some details on what I need to do to elongate this hole. So basically the hole needs to extend up to this point where you can see the marks on the chassis. So I'm going to have to cut them out with a hole saw and grinder to elongate them slightly. So it's the same for this other side as well. The other thing is, once I fit off the steering rack, it actually makes it really difficult to be able to fit off all the nuts and bolts and support brackets for a sort of a corner bracket, I suppose you would call it, that goes inside the footwell. And then if I come around here, the front and lower control arms will feed through here and then get bolted through that into that bracket. So before I get too far with the steering rack, I'll have a look at actually installing those corner brackets properly. They do need to be sealed, so they need a waterproof silicone sealant, because obviously this is all open to the elements when you're driving and you don't want to get wet feet while you're driving. So as I just mentioned, the first step will be to core out and elongate that hole. Now the problem is, to not go too far, the center point of this hole actually sits within the existing hole. So I'm gonna have to find a way to try and put a piece of timber or something inside there that I can put a pilot hole in to then guide where this new hole will go. I'm just going to put a couple of screws into some of these holes. Just to hold the board in place while I'm coring that larger hole. And just a larger screw here for this larger pre-drill hole. And that should hold that board in place nicely and allow me to find a center point and keep that hole aligned. So I'm just going to mark out my spacing that needs to be 135 millimeters from the top. And I'm going to start by just drilling a pilot hole with a wood drill bit. It does have a nice point on the end of it, so that will definitely help in ensuring that we keep it centered. Alright, with the pilot hole now in the timber there, it's roughly the same size as the hole that I have, or the drill bit that I have as my guide in the hole saw. I can now look at getting this hole cut in the metal. Put a little bit of cutting fluid on that. I did forget to put some on before I started. So it's hard to actually hold that drill bit steady as I was coring that out. Look, it's a little bit messy, but maybe a little bit just off center in the end. But all in all, we should be able to trim it up so that it looks nice and it won't look too out of place. So I'll just try and trim some of those corners off with the angle grinder and then I'll sand it back a bit. I can't believe after all of that, I forgot to bloody hit record. But that's the elongated hole. You see the round one on the other side. I'll make a move over to that side and try and remember to hit the record button this time, so you can see exactly how I did it. But basically, cut it out with the hole saw, used a grinder just to cut the little sides off, just to sort of smooth it out. And then I used a sander to just smooth it all over. Got the file out for a few of the rough bits, and it's got a nice smooth finish now. Shouldn't cause us any problems or catch or cut the boots around the steering arms. Okay, so now for the other side. I've screwed the board in. Luckily enough, the same screw holes were able to be used as the other side. I suppose that's the beauty of having a fairly symmetrical chassis design. I did have an issue with the other side. Unfortunately, you obviously didn't see it because I forgot to turn the camera on, but I found that the drill bit was moving quite a lot in the timber. So I have just used an offcut from when I cut out the pedal assembly, just so that I can use that drill hole as a guide. It should be a bit more sturdy than just having it sort of slop around within the timber hole that I drilled. So here we go again, side 2. Let's see how we go. And there we go. Much easier than the other side, I will admit. I'll remove this board. I'll trim up the two sides, just where I've got the little peak from the where the two holes join. Give it a sand and it should finish off nicely just like the other side. So I'm now going to have a go at it with just the oscillating saw. It seemed to work really well on the other side. And we'll just give it a bit of a file for some of the rough areas, and then I'll use just the oscillating sander. So I'm going to switch to the sander. I'm just starting with an 80 grit sanding pad. Now I'm switching to a 120 grit sandpaper. So there we have it. It's the second side cut out. So now you can see right through both sides. We've got the elongated holes that we require for those steering arms to poke through. So I'm going to bust out the vacuum cleaner and clean up all those metal filings. And I think we'll probably call it there for today's episode. Tune into next episode where I'll complete the installation of the steering rack and I'll show you the complete system, steering rack and steering column installed. If you like these episodes, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss future releases, and turn on that notification button.